remember it so well. I met Amy a couple months before when she moved to town, and the reality is we hung out quite a bit because we enjoyed a lot of the same things. She was so sweet. She always laughed when we interacted, and she smiled a lot when we talked. And the reality was that there may have been some flirting going on, I'll admit it. I remember that night that the moon was shining in the bus window when we were on our way home. It was about an hour ride home, and to be honest, we hadn't planned it. We ended our day at the same time and happened to sit next to each other on the bus on the way home. And as the trip continued, the chit-chat just got better and better. And I realized that this was probably the time. This was the time that I was going to tell Amy that she was, without a doubt, the cutest girl in 7th grade. And I was going to ask her to be my girlfriend. We were on the way home from some school activity, and as we leaned up against the bus window, she leaned on my shoulder. It was money. But the reality was that in the back of my mind, something started to really make me think again, oh my gosh, can I really ask her this? Until I looked down at my watch and I realized what time it was. It was about 11:45. And then I realized what day it was. And I was about to become the smoothest guy at Elida Middle School because I was going to ask the cutest girl out at the stroke of midnight on Valentine's Day. Good or what? So I could tell you actually about the years since then as our marriage has grown and as we've had kids and just the years spent getting to know each other. I could tell you that, but she decided to respond to me when I asked by saying, "But I like our friendship so much. I just wouldn't want to sacrifice that." Ladies, how do you know that line in 7th grade? I mean, that's just ridiculous. So I was off. I was 0-1 in the category of the DTR. Did you catch that? The DTR? This is the conversation that every 7th grade boy wants to be the master at. It's the DTR conversation, defining the relationship. Now, maybe that's not something that you've heard before. Maybe you live in a place where you don't use that. But here's the reality. This is a conversation that even as an adult, I'm a bit perplexed by. This is that conversation that honestly, you got to get it right. Like, there's no going back on this conversation. You know, maybe you've hung out for a while. You've gone out a couple times. Maybe you've expressed interest. Maybe, honestly, a couple drinks have turned into hooking up. And the reality is you've got to figure out what this relationship looks like. It's time to figure out where the two of you are going and what it's going to be like. You just kind of define the relationship. But the problem is you've got to get this conversation right. You know, it's got to have perfect clarity. You've got to have a good understanding. You've got to have a language so that you can act on it, because there's nothing worse than walking out of the DTR conversation without defining the relationship. When there's less clarity walking out than there was going in, you know you're hosed then. You know, it's like one of those things that, well, did he mean that he's going to date other women? Or is she going to freak out if I call her my girlfriend? And maybe you're thinking, is it okay to call him tomorrow, or do I need to wait for him to call me 3 days after the last date? And if you don't get it right, sometimes other people define the relationship for you. Well, you know, if you had sex, then surely he loves you, might be something that you could hear. Or you might hear from somebody, you know, she's not good enough for you, right? So whatever your culture is, or wherever you're at in life, you know those conversations where you define the relationship. But the reality is that it's hard these days to define any relationship. You know, those conversations where you have open and honest and frank discussions about relationships in our life, they're hard to come by. And it's sometimes difficult to walk through those things and figure out how those experiences and how dating in general even intersects with God. Well, we're unashamed here about the central message at the I Want an Awesome Marriage Facebook site. We're unashamed about the fact that to get all of those other relationships in our life squared away in the way that they were intended to be, we've got to get the first and the primary relationship in place first. You know, the reality is this isn't a seminar about 6 ways to make sure that the one falls in love with you, to make sure that that guy falls in love with you. It's not about 4 ways to find the love of your life. This seminar is about the reality that God has defined a relationship with us long ago. He has DTR'd with us. God is the one who is the ultimate DTR. He has the ultimate DTR conversation with us. You see, God defines this relationship right here in the Bible. It's in the first few pages of the book of Genesis. That's truly what this book is. It's God defining his relationship with us. Genesis 1:27 says this. It says, "So God created mankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female, he created them." God creates the first people, Adam and Eve, and he made them to be image bearers of him. He made them really to be mirrors, if you will, reflecting to all of creation who God is. We were designed to reflect God to all of creation. It's who we're meant to be. It's who we're created to be, so that we could perfectly display exactly who he is. All of his character, his love, his mercy, his grace, his perfection, his holiness. He's set apart from us. We were made to be mirrors to all of the rest of creation, who he is. So God puts them in a garden, right in the middle of everything. And he gives them responsibilities to have kids, to be fruitful and multiply, it says. And tell everybody, be image bearers to everything about who I am. Do your job as reflectors of God to all of creation. And they walked and they talked with God, and the reality was that relationship was perfect. There was nothing wrong. They did the perfect job at being reflectors of who God is. The unity between Adam and Eve was perfect, just as the unity between Adam and Eve and God was perfect. Nothing got in their way. It's kind of like when I pick up this jersey and I put it on, right here. Some of you know something about me instantly. You know, the reality is that I Want an Awesome Marriage Facebook page, South Africa is actually one of the places that's most visited from. And this is a Springboks jersey. And you know something about me if you're a Springboks fan. There's an identity that I have. There's an image that I bear when I hold this up, and you like it. Or maybe you're from New Zealand and you're an All Blacks fan, and honestly, you hate me now, and you're not going to listen to me anymore. But please, just put that aside. Because the reality is that you know something about me because I'm bearing the image of the Springboks. You're a rugby fan. You know I've been to South Africa now. You know I've got hooked on rugby. And the reality is you know something about me because I'm bearing the image of the Springboks. It's just like that for Adam and Eve. They were bearing the image of God. But here's the deal. They had one requirement. God asked one thing of them. He said, don't eat of the fruit of that tree over there. And it seems really simple, almost trite, that what they did was they went and eat that fruit. And it seems so insignificant, but the reality was that in that moment, by their actions, what they did was they stopped being an image bearer. What they said was, hey, I've got a better idea of how this thing works than you do, God. They said by their actions that the reality was that they knew what they were doing better than God was. And in that moment, they went from being image bearers to ones who were broken. They weren't just broken, they were shattered. And suddenly, they couldn't reflect who God was perfectly anymore. Not only that, their relationship with God was broken. It was shattered in 1,000 pieces, just like a mirror might be. And the rest of this book, all of these pages back here, are God working through thousands and thousands of years to put back together again what was broken when human beings said, we've got a better plan than you do, God. See, Adam and Eve began to have kids, and they had lots of kids. But they were broken mirrors, and broken mirrors can only produce other broken mirrors. And the more kids they had, the worse things got. Until finally God chose an entire nation, Israel. He chose that nation so he could work a plan through them to put things back together again. And so what he did was he sent them into slavery. And then to prove how powerful he was, he brought them back out again. He had them cross through a river in dry land. He had to wander around the desert for 40 years to prove to them over and over again that they could trust him. And it didn't stop there. He went on to produce a kingdom so that he could not just be the author, but he could perfectly put together a plan to write a story that he could star in. So he didn't just author the story, he made his appearance as the main character of the story. And all that time, he was saying to the nation of Israel, I am the Lord your God. You can trust me. You can love me. I'm going to put this thing back together again. But instead of staying on the outside, he stepped in. Jesus comes into this world as a part of that nation of Israel. And he is the main character of this book, of this story. God came to earth in the form of Jesus to put things back together again. Now, it would take a long time to walk through every one of these pages of this story and figure out just how did that page play into this whole story. But that's really the challenge that you and I have as we begin to walk through this thing called the Bible. We ask that question of every story that we read. How does this story fit into the big picture of what God is doing in our lives? In that big picture of how God is putting us back together again as image bearers. Because God is in the business of being the ultimate DTR. He's defining the relationship in every one of those stories with a nation and with people like you and me. And that's good. That's a good story to know. But I think what happens is Christians sometimes stay up on that theoretical level, that story about God. But the reality is that it applies to life right here as well. Because it's great that God has a story, but the reality is, you know what? I've got a story too. And you do as well. Maybe your story is that you're in college and you're in that time of life when you're exploring and asking questions of yourself, trying to figure out who you are and figure out who you want to date. And you know that someday you're going to get married. Maybe that story for you is that that's taken a whole lot longer than you expect. That year after year after year has gone by and you haven't met the person that you thought you were going to marry someday. Maybe you've had one of those conversations, one of those DTR conversations, and it turned out awesome. And you ended up getting married. But before you could celebrate a couple anniversaries, things went really bad. And you were upset and angry, and you found yourself in front of the judge asking for a divorce. Maybe you thought things were going really well, but then there was that day that it felt like you got punched in the stomach when you found out that your spouse had cheated on you. Maybe you were in love, madly in love, until the day you got the diagnosis, or in an instant, in the tragedy, your love was taken away from you. See, as fractured mirrors, our stories are fractured too. Our stories are broken. And we all have these pains and these hurts. And honestly, it's hard to believe that we really were created to be an image bearer of God. You could even say that we have a God-shaped hole in our heart. And we get so used to being okay with reflecting just a little bit of God that we forget that we were meant for so much more. We were meant for God's ultimate DTR, but we are far too easily pleased. We were meant for God's ultimate DTR, but we're far too easily pleased. We have a purpose that's to be in a perfect relationship with God, but so often we settle for jumping from relationship to relationship to relationship, and they're fractured and they're broken. We're designed to get meaning and our value from the creator of the universe, the one who made us, who ultimately is in charge of everything. That's where we're supposed to get our meaning, but instead, we get our meaning from whether or not we're married. We get our value from the people around us and whether we think they like us or not, whether we think they could fall in love with us, whether we think that we're lovable. We were meant to hear from our Creator that we're beautiful. But instead, you wait and you hope that some guy sometime might say that just once. We were meant for the joy of relationships, which leads to deep and authentic intimacy. But we settle for so much less. We settle for fake intimacy by hopping from bed to bed with people. Fake intimacy through sex that is honestly never going to please. We're meant to be satisfied and filled by the infinite God But instead, we settle again and again for the things that whisper in our ear that tell us that they'll satisfy. We were meant to be complete in God, but what we do, we settle for Jerry Maguire. Now, I know you saw this movie. In this movie, Jerry walks into the living room and there's all these women around, and he says, this is where I'm supposed to be really good. I'm supposed to be good in the living room. And he's trying to win back his wife, right? And he has this just beautiful, authentic, it's a masterful speech. And he finally gets to that point where he says, "You complete me." And she responds with the line that makes me want to throw up, honestly. But she says, "Shut up. Just shut up. You had me at hello." Right? That's not what we were meant for. We were meant for God to complete us, but so often we believe the lie that another person is going to complete us. We were meant for the ultimate DTR, but we're far too easily pleased. So what do we do? What do we do with that? Well, that's what this seminar is about. And I know I've talked about a lot of ideas, and the reality is that the sessions that are going to come after this, they're going to get into specifics, and they're going to talk about how we can go about renewing our mind, refreshing our perspective, and changing everything about how we view ourselves so that we really can have that ultimate DTR with God. The story that we talked about it's such a big story that sometimes it's easy to forget that we're wrapped up in it every moment of every day. It's easy to think that it's a make-believe story, a children's story almost, that it's ancient people doing things in places that I don't know. But the reality is that story is the big story, and my story and your story fall inside of that. I was talking to Joe the other day at church, and Joe was telling me about his life. It wasn't an easy life by any means. He had grown up, and really from the time he could drive, he got all of his cash by selling drugs. He used drugs all the time. He sold drugs. And before long, his identity was wrapped up in that culture. His life started to slide out of control, and he couldn't get out of it. All of his relationships were destroyed. Everything in his life just was falling apart because of what he was doing. He was defining his life by the circumstances around him. And honestly, he said that it just was horrible. He did get married, but his marriage started to fall apart. But then Joe encountered the God of that story. What he recognized was that God that came into the story. He went to the cross and he paid for the sins that Joe had committed. And to be honest, his life was never the same. He realized that the big story intersected his story, and that he had himself done things that fractured his life. He was shattered, but Jesus went to the cross to put him back together again. And what he told me was a story of how day by day God did that. And it wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't overnight. It wasn't something that he just miraculously did. But as Joe learned more about how to go about walking with God and how to give more and more of his life to him, the God transformed his life and he put him back together again. And that's the story. That's the DTR that we need to be aware of, that we need to accept. And here's the reality. That may be a story that you've heard before. That might be something that you've heard all your life. Or maybe that's something that's brand new. That big picture view of what God's doing and the small picture of what Christ has done to forgive you of the sins that you have that have fractured your life and your relationship, maybe that's new to you. If that's the case, and if that's a decision that you want to make to commit your life to the God that has done that, there are some resources right down below. Click on one of those links, grab some of those resources and dive in and start to say, God, how is it that I can find you as the one who have defined this relationship for me in ways that I can't even imagine? And when you do that, He's going to put you back together again. He's going to find ways that you can just take all of the areas of your life that seem fractured and broken, and over time, He'll work those back together. And He takes the mirror that's in 1,000 little pieces on the ground, and He puts it back together again and makes you an image bearer of Him all over again. Let me pray. God, this is such a huge, huge story. And it's so easy to get wrapped up in the big picture and just to think thoughts. But the reality is that impacts this moment right now as you sit here As we sit here and watch her and listen and think about you, this second of this day is impacted by that story. God, I pray that you would show us the ways that we've failed to be your image bearers. And God, show us the ways that we can commit our life to you, the way we can give back what we have that's broken to you and ask you to put it together again. God, overwhelm us with how good you are, how incredible you are. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.